rope hangs over the edge of a 400-foot cliff, disappearing into the fog below, as one wounded soldier is slowly lowered down, then another, and then another. At the top of that cliff, explosions tear through the ground, fire flashes in every direction, and enemy soldiers are closing in fast. There's no cover, no backup, no way out, and no weapon. Just one man standing at the edge, a medic refusing to leave. Hours earlier, 155 soldiers climbed that cliff, but by now, most have retreated, leaving 75 wounded men behind on a battlefield they can't escape. And while everyone else ran, he stayed, alone, under constant fire, with nothing but a rope and his bare hands tearing apart as he lowers each man to safety. The enemy is only feet away, the rope is fraying, his strength is fading, but he keeps going, because for him, this isn't about survival, it's about saving one more life. And by the time the sun begins to fall, this one unarmed soldier will do something no one thought was possible. May 5th, 1945. The Battle of Okinawa had reached one of its most brutal phases, and on a jagged stretch of rock known as the Maida Escarpment, a single rope hung over the edge of a 400-foot cliff. One wounded soldier was slowly being lowered down into the fog below. Then another followed, then another. At the top of that cliff, explosions ripped through the ground as mortar shells landed dangerously close, sending dirt and debris into the air, while enemy troops moved steadily forward, closing the distance with every passing moment. There was no cover, no safe position, and no reinforcements coming. And yet, at the very edge of that cliff, one man remained, a medic, unarmed, alone, and unwilling to leave. Earlier that morning, 155 American soldiers had climbed that same cliff using cargo nets, hauling themselves upward into what they hoped would be a strategic advantage. Instead, they were met with overwhelming resistance. The enemy had spent months fortifying the position, turning it into a deadly network of hidden defenses. Within a short time, the plateau became a storm of gunfire, explosions, and chaos. Men were hit from multiple directions. Orders were shouted, lost, and shouted again. Within the first phase of the assault, nearly half the unit was wounded. The situation became impossible to hold. With no viable way to defend the position and no clear path forward, the able-bodied soldiers were ordered to retreat. It was the only option left, but not everyone could leave. 75 wounded men were stranded at the top, unable to move, surrounded by enemy forces that were determined to hold their ground at any cost. Among those left behind was Desmond Doss. He had no weapon, no orders to stay, and no obligation to remain on that ridge, but he chose to stay anyway. What makes that decision even more remarkable is that Doss had spent months before this moment being treated as an outsider within his own unit. Back in 1942, when he was drafted, he had made a simple but firm declaration. He would serve his country. He would go to war, but he would not take a life. His beliefs, shaped by his faith, led him to refuse carrying a weapon. To many around him, that made no sense. In a place where survival often depended on force, refusing to carry a rifle was seen as weakness. During training, that perception turned into hostility. He was mocked, isolated, and pushed to his limits by the very men he was meant to stand beside in combat. His belongings were tampered with, his faith was ridiculed, and he was pressured repeatedly to leave. Some tried to have him removed from service entirely, but every attempt failed, not because the system supported him, but because he refused to give up. He showed up to every drill, completed every requirement he could, and focused intensely on becoming the best medic he could be. He didn't argue, he didn't retaliate, he endured. And when challenged, he made one thing clear. He would be there when it mattered, saving lives. That promise began to take shape in earlier battles. In places like Guam and later the Philippines, Dos proved himself under fire. While others took cover, he moved toward danger. He treated wounds in open combat zones, stopped bleeding under pressure, and carried injured soldiers to safety, again and again. He did all of this without a weapon, without hesitation, and without asking for recognition. Slowly, the same men who once doubted him began to see something different. They began to trust him. They began to rely on him. And eventually, they began to respect him. But nothing compared to what happened on that ridge in Okinawa. Alone on the plateau, with wounded men scattered across the battlefield, Dos made a decision that would define everything that followed. He would not leave anyone behind. He moved from one injured soldier to another, assessing wounds, offering reassurance, and dragging them toward the edge of the cliff. There, he found a rope. Securing it as best as he could, he began lowering the wounded down the steep drop, one by one. There was no structured plan, no formal training for this kind of evacuation. It was a solution born out of necessity, carried out under constant threat. Each descent required focus and strength. Each movement risked drawing attention. The rope cut into his hands as he worked, the friction tearing at his skin. But he didn't stop. After lowering one man, he would turn back toward the battlefield, searching for another. Time lost its meaning. The only thing that mattered was the next life he could save. As the hours passed, the danger only increased. Enemy forces moved closer. The sounds of battle grew louder. His risk became overwhelming. But he continued. Those who witnessed it later described a pattern. He would lower a man down, pause briefly, and then return for another. Over and over again. It wasn't just physical endurance. It was something deeper, a level of commitment that went beyond orders, beyond expectation, beyond logic. By the time the effort ended, dozens of men had been brought to safety. The widely accepted number is 75. 75 lives saved by one man who carried no weapon and stood alone in one of the most dangerous positions on the battlefield. When he finally descended from the ridge, exhausted and injured, the reaction from his fellow soldiers had completely changed. The man they once questioned had become the one they depended on most. The medic they doubted had become the reason many of them were still alive. But even after that, his story didn't end. Not long after the events on the escarpment, Dos was seriously wounded during combat. A grenade explosion caused severe injuries, leaving him alone and in pain. Instead of immediately calling for help, he treated his own wounds as best as he could and waited. When rescue teams eventually reached him, he made another selfless choice. He insisted that another, more critically injured soldier be taken first. Even then, even after everything he had already done, he put someone else ahead of himself. Later that year, he was brought to the White House, where Harry S. Truman presented him with the Medal of Honor. It was a recognition of actions that had gone far beyond what anyone could have expected. He became the first conscientious objector to receive the award, a moment that symbolized not just personal bravery, but a shift in how courage itself could be understood. Yet recognition did not erase the cost. The injuries he sustained during the war had lasting effects. His health declined in the years that followed, and his body carried the consequences of everything he had endured. The medal represented honor, but it could not undo the damage. Still, he never expressed regret for the choices he made. What remains is the legacy of those actions. A man who refused to carry a weapon stood in one of the most dangerous places imaginable and saved dozens of lives. He didn't change his beliefs, to fit the situation. He didn't step away when things became impossible. He stayed. And because he stayed, 75 men lived to see another day. His story challenges the way courage is often defined. It shows that strength is not always measured by force, and that standing firm in your principles can be just as powerful as any weapon. In a moment when everything depended on action, he chose to act, not by taking lives, but by saving them. We have come to the end of our story. Thank you for watching. If you liked it, don't forget to like and subscribe, and turn on the bell notification so you don't miss new videos.